the worst performing farms in our study had lameness prevalences of between 15 and 32%. So there's a lot of farms in the country that have high lameness, and it is a huge problem as such. It is a significant welfare and sustainability and productivity cost to farmers and cows.
I'm joined this week by Muireann Conneely, Teagasc dairy researcher with a specific interest in animal welfare. Muireann joins us to discuss the impact of lameness on Irish dairy farms, detecting and dealing with lameness issues, and putting prevention measures in place at farm level. So thanks for joining us, Muireann.
No problem, James. Thank you very much for having me.
Maybe to start, how big of an issue is lameness on Irish dairy farms today?
Well, it's a big issue. That is my opinion and what we've seen from our research. So we have done studies where we've gone out and we have measured the prevalence of lameness, and our average lameness on farm was about 10%. And I suppose while you look at that figure and you might think 10%, that's not too bad. And in fact, it does compare very favorably with the lameness prevalence that we'd see in indoor systems in the UK and the US, for example, which typically have lameness prevalences up around 30 to 50%. 10% is still a lot of cows, 10 out of every 100 cows, and it is a significant welfare and sustainability and productivity cost to farmers and cows. And I suppose one good point to mention there, James, as well, is that the 10% is just an average, and that kind of that doesn't represent the maximum lameness levels we saw. So we saw a whole range ranging from 0% of lameness right up to 32%. And I suppose the worst performing farms in our study had lameness prevalences of between 15 and 32%. So there's a lot of farms in the country that have high lameness, and it is a huge problem as such.
And at what point, you're talking about 10% there, Muireann, at what point can you say you obviously have individual animal lameness issues, but then at what percentage are you saying that there's a herd level issue?
Well, I guess, yeah, I suppose 10% would be a sort of a cutoff there, so under 10%, you're kind of saying, well, it's kind of all right, it's not too bad. Over 10%, you really need to be looking at what can I do to reduce this? That said, it's very possible to get lameness down below that 10%. And I spoke about the worst performing 20% of farms in our study. The best performing 20% of farmers in our study had lameness below 5%. So I think 5% is, below 5% is a target we should all be aiming for.
You mentioned there about costs associated. Like have the impacts of lameness been quantified? How does it affect cow performance, milk yield, fertility, longevity, and is there a financial cost that Teagasc have associated with that?
Yeah, so there has been a lot of work done in this area, I suppose, in many different countries, and people have quantified the impacts, and they're well known. Lameness has huge implications for reproductive performance, milk yield, and longevity. So I suppose we'll just maybe touch on each of those. With regards to reproduction, and we have done some research here. Aisling O'Connor did some research here, and she showed that with cows that have a mobility score of 2, and maybe we'll talk about mobility scoring later, but these are lame cows, not severely lame, but definitely lame. They have an increased calving interval of 3.5 days. And then if you increase the mobility score to 3, these are severely lame cows, the calving interval is increased to 6 days. Other studies have shown that conception rate drops by 20%. You can have a week longer to the first service and, more services per conception. And the reason, I suppose, it has this effect on reproduction is there's for a number of reasons. One is lame cows are in pain. There's higher cortisol in the system. This all impacts the reproductive cycle. But also then lame cows don't want to stand to be mounted. So heat detection is more difficult. So that's where you get the repro effects. Um, Moving on to milk yield, then, there's a big impact on milk yield, and maybe farmers aren't fully aware of this. And I guess it depends. The impact on milk yield, lame cows produce less milk, and this can happen up to 3 months before they're actually diagnosed with lameness. And other studies have shown that it can go on for up to 5 months after diagnosis. And the impact on milk yield depends on whether the cow gets lame before or after her peak yield. And it also depends on other factors like cow type, her production potential, her parity. Um, but again, coming back to Irish research, Aisling O'Connor did a bit of work in this area again and showed that for a cow that's severely lame, she would have a 6% drop in her total 305 day milk yield. So that would equate, in an average 6,000 litre herd to a loss of 360 litres. And other studies then have put that figure, total loss in milk production over the course of the lactation, somewhere between 270 kilos and 570 kilos, depending on the type of lameness. So it's a huge cost, and maybe farmers aren't fully aware of that.
That was my next question, Muireann. Is it something from your work in this space? Is it underestimated the impact that it maybe has on herd production levels and,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
farm
Well, like
production?
we didn't in our study, we didn't specifically ask farmers, what do they think it's
Mm.
costing, or so I don't know, but just from talking to farmers, my experience has been that yeah, they don't really understand. Like to go back to the average 10% prevalence of lameness, myself and Owen Ryan from UCD kind of did an updated cost estimate of what this would cost for the average 100 cow herd in Ireland.
Mm.
And that is coming out at roughly 8,750 euros per year. So it is a significant cost, even if we say 10% is, not too
And you're
bad,
saying, yeah, that's
you
the
know,
average. That's the
that
average figure, as you say.
that
Anyone
that would
above
be the
that,
average figure, and that's an estimate. It depends on the type of lameness you have, and because more severe lesions have greater impact on milk production and so on. But that's kind of a rough estimate, and
it's
one,
significant when you
yeah,
think that's 87 euros per cow on average across the 100. For every cow in the herd,
yes, yeah,
although it won't fall like that, but it's a significant cost at
it
farm
is,
level.
yeah, it sure is,
One thing I want to pick up on, and I think maybe this is where sometimes farmers struggle in terms of mobility scoring, and it's a bit like body condition scoring. It probably doesn't happen enough more
yes,
on farms. And uh, personally, I think maybe that's a fear of, you know, what's a two, what's a three, and maybe getting too caught up with that element. Is that fair to say? And maybe can you just describe to farmers what it is and how it helps in terms of managing lameness?
yeah. Well, I suppose mobility scoring is basically looking at your cows individually and assigning them a score. Basically, you're trying to pick up the cows that are lame. And the reason you're trying to do that is because you want to get them early in the course of the lameness, because the earlier you can identify them, the better chance they have of recovery, and the lower the productivity losses will be associated. So the point of mobility scoring is to identify these cows earlier. And we can all say, well, sure, I see them every day. I walk them to and from the parlor. I can pick them up. But it's actually, you have a much greater chance of identifying them early, and the kind of the slightly milder cases of lameness, if you're specifically looking at them individually, not just noticing the really lame cows that are hanging out at the back of the herd. So and I guess, yeah, it's not being done in Ireland. Our study showed that only 1% of farmers were actually mobility scoring regularly, and most of the farmers didn't actually even know really what it was.
Mm.
So that's something we're trying to address. I guess I'm part of the Animal Health Ireland Technical Working Group on lameness, and we're trying to get together some resources just to improve information to farmers. We've already produced a number of videos which can be seen on the AHI YouTube channel, but a further video on mobility scoring is in production at the moment, and we hope that will give farmers some information on how they can do it, and and so on.
And as you said, that it's really to pick up those cows that aren't obvious. We can all see the obvious as as cows come in and out in terms of from the milking process. But it's to
Yes.
pick up those. It's to pick up those early ones to get in really ahead of where there's an actual clearly visible issue at farm
Yeah,
level.
well, so mobility scoring divides cows. You can score them as four different scores.
Mm,
So there's zero, which is completely normal, perfect mobility, nothing wrong. Then there's one where maybe not perfect mobility, but she might have some shortened stride or maybe a slight
mm,
arch in the back or something is a little bit off, but you can't actually say, well, she's definitely, lame. And on that leg, on the left leg, say. Um, those cows benefit from further monitoring. Say you'd want to keep a close eye on them, maybe, to see does it develop further. You mightn't necessarily be in a rush to pick her up straight away, depending on the time that you have. Um, then score two cows are definitely lame. You can identify a leg, but again, there's a bit of a spectrum there in the score two. You can have, borderline 1/2s
mm.
that you might be questioning a bit. And then there's, fairly obvious twos. The score threes then are severely lame. Those would be very obvious. Farmers are very good at identifying the score threes where they're really very obviously lame on one leg and they're kind of hopping and they're much slower than the other cows. By the time the cow gets to be a score three, they've been lame for a long time and their chances of recovery are slim. So really where we want to be taking action is at when they're first identified at mobility score two. And some farmers are good at picking up score twos, but a lot of farmers can identify the score threes and maybe not the score twos. But mobility scoring gives you a chance to kind of get your eye in and sort of spot those mobility score two cows earlier. And then the key thing is to pick those cows up and to look at their feet as soon as possible, definitely within 24 hours. And that's something that farmers aren't
Yeah.
really doing. They're just not getting in there early enough. And that has a big impact on the outcome.
Yeah, and you mentioned that there, and at what point, I suppose, the idea where it slips by, yeah, period slips by, more farmers are busy. How important is that early intervention for the farmer to have the ability to actually lift cow's feet themselves? And then
Yeah.
I suppose the final part of that is, when do you get a professional hoof trimmer in or a vet in to deal with issues?
Yeah. Well, I think it's very useful for farmers to have the confidence to be able to lift the cows and the equipment, I suppose, as well, to lift a cow's leg safely as soon as they see a cow being lame, because there can be delays in getting hoof trimmers, um, and so on. And definitely it's important to get in there early. There's been studies, a study in Nottingham showed that cows that were chronically lame um, were lame for more than 4 weeks, they only had recovery rates of about 15 to 16% compared to another study they did where cows that were treated sooner all had recovery rates of around 70 to 80%. So it has a huge impact. In terms of when the farmer should call a hoof trimmer or a vet, it kind of depends a little bit, I suppose, on the farmer's expertise in the area and their own level of confidence in dealing with lameness issues. And some farmers do a lot of their own trimming and maybe have done training courses, and there are training courses available for farmers to get up to speed with hoof trimming and treating lame cows, and definitely well worth doing. So it kind of depends, really, but I think maybe there is a tendency to leave it a little bit too late for some farmers, and they would benefit from getting the vet or the hoof trimmer in earlier. And it's probably also worth mentioning that um, for larger herds, it may be a very good idea to have a standing arrangement with a hoof trimmer to come regularly, maybe every 2 weeks, depending on the size of the herd and whether there's lameness issues, that there is that regular checking of cows and lifting of cows' legs, um, to get in there early before problems get severe.
That was actually a question I had here in terms of how important is regular hoof trimming. Um, Even you mentioned it there, where there's going to be a number of cows in larger herds, but regular hoof trimming in general, as a preventative measure, Muireann, how important is it, and when should farmers be thinking about doing those sort of things?
Yeah, so it is important, and when we say preventative hoof trimming, I suppose it's probably good to make the distinction between regular preventative hoof inspection and trimming then if needed, because not every
Mm.
cow will need a trim. Say, our cows do a lot of walking, and they often can wear down their hooves quite well themselves and maybe don't need a trim if there isn't anything to correct. But there can be uneven wear and there might need to be a bit of corrective trimming to change the weight-bearing surfaces, which can prevent lameness issues developing. So again, it's not something Irish farmers are doing a huge amount of, but it's definitely the best practice advice would be to get the whole herd um, routinely inspected at least once a year, and those cows then that need trimming, um, that can be done if necessary then. But and a good time to do this would be before drying off, say before housing in the winter time. But it is a big job to lift every cow's foot in on the farm. So, it may not be practical or possible for everybody. And in those cases, I suppose you could adopt a more targeted approach. And instead of lifting absolutely every cow, which would be the best practice, you could look at maybe the older cows, the cows that have had a history of being lame before, cows that tend to be towards the back of the herd, targeted a little bit more if you can't go lifting every single cow. But ideally, best practice would be to lift every cow.
What are the main causes of lameness that throughout the studies, what are the main causes that you've seen on Irish dairy
Yeah,
farms?
so Irish dairy farms, the main causes are the those non-infectious. So we can divide lameness into two broad categories. One is non-infectious causes, and they're disorders of the claw horn formation, I suppose, which um, include white line disease, solar bruising or hemorrhage, and sole ulcers. And they typically happen because of trauma, damage to the formation of the horn of the sole as it's developing because of trauma from stones or roadways or too long standing time, stuff like that. Then the other category then is the infectious diseases, which include things like digital dermatitis or mortellaro, foul in the foot, heel horn necrosis, and they're caused by infectious organisms and spread through dirty environments. So the most common lesion types in our system are the non-infectious, and Natasha Brown's work. She's the PhD student as she was then who did this large-scale on-farm study. She found that the most common lesions were white line disease and solar bruising or hemorrhage. So there was a bit of Mortellaro, certainly, but at a much lower level. It was down around the 14%, whereas the other was 95% of lesions were infectious.
And dealing with those two different types of lameness, we've obviously mentioned the hoof trimming element, but what should farmers be doing to deal with those issues?
Yeah, well, I suppose, yeah, that's the big thing, really. I guess, yeah, you need to look at when you're trying to tackle a lameness problem on your farm, you need to look at what sort of lesions you're experiencing, and that will point you in the direction of where you need to move to tackle it. So if you're talking about infectious lesions like Mortellaro, you need to look at the hygiene, your in your housing, in and around the milking parlour, because it's spread through the slurry, and so that's the really key area. You need to look at your foot bathing regimes and what you're doing all around that. If you're talking about non-infectious clawhorn lesions, white line, you're looking at more your roadways, your collecting yards, your cow handling approach as well, because that's actually very important. The way we handle our cows has big impact on the development of lameness because if they're, if they're being rushed and if they're being moved too quickly, they can't take the time to put their feet where they can see is a safe spot without any stones. So that actually has a big impact. So yeah, so it your approach to your lameness issue very much depends on what's causing it.
There's a couple of them I want to come back to. Maybe the first one there is foot bathing. Um, it's important. We mentioned it there from a treatment point of view, but I suppose it has two roles in terms of treatment and prevention. How regular should it be completed? What's best practice? What products should be used? More and where you see it, where you see the foot bathing practice maybe fall down on farm at
Yeah,
farm level. What are the issues that
yeah.
arise?
So I suppose like when it comes to foot bathing, there isn't really one size fits all best practice recommendation. It very much depends on what's going on your individual farm. And if there is a mortellaro problem, then foot bathing is very important. If it's a mortellaro problem that's sort of under control, you may be okay doing a foot bathing regime of weekly, but if it's a kind of a crisis where things are really getting out of hand, you may need to up that frequency to twice a day for a couple of weeks to get that under control. So it's not possible to give a sort of a standard best practice recommendation, but definitely, talk to your vet or your hoof trimmer and get tailored advice for your own situation. Um, the product, in terms of the products, there's loads of products that you can be used. I don't know that there's any research that shows that one product is particularly better than another. The key thing is to use it in the correct way and to make sure it's being used at the appropriate dilution rate. And that's probably one of the key things. Now, some of the products that people use have health implications for humans as well, such as formalin is a known carcinogen. So, there's disadvantages to some of them, certainly, but there's a lot of different products on the market. Where people fall down, I suppose, is well, as I said, making sure the solution is being used at the correct concentration is really important. So that's probably one of the bigger things that people aren't doing, that you need to actually sit down and do some calculations. And I mentioned the AHI videos before. We do have one that's kind of focused on foot baths, and there's a very nice explanation in there of how to calculate the volume of your foot bath and to make sure that the reagent you're using is at the correct concentration. Because if it's not at the correct concentration, it's not going to be doing anything. I suppose the important things there as well are to make sure your foot bath is a good, appropriate design, that it's filled to the level that's needed, 12 centimeters to get that coverage of the cow's feet, that they can take a number of strides to get coverage there going through it, that it's changed often enough is the main thing. You need to change the solution every 200 cow passes, because otherwise it's getting contaminated and dirty. And there's very little point in foot bathing if they're just walking through a foot bath of muck and dung, and if it's not at the correct concentration. So if people want to know more about that, I definitely advise having a look at that video because that explains it in great detail.
Couple of other points I want to maybe the roadways piece and sure the importance of that in grazing systems, and
Yeah.
cows do a lot of walking to and from pasture. Just talk to me about the roadways piece and how important it is.
Yeah, sure. It's hugely important. We do have our cows walking long distances every day, twice a day, and it has a huge role to play. As I said, the most common types of lesions we see are the non-infectious lesions, the bruises, and things like that. And roadways have a huge role to play in that. So it's important to keep them well maintained and to address any areas that need to be addressed. We don't want stones, stones, big stones. There should be a nice fine covering top dressing on the roads that don't have stones that are going to cause bruising and damage and that. And, there's lots of considerations as well in terms of, having the correct slope on the roadway so you don't get too much water pooling and
Mm.
all of that. Again, there's a good bit of information in the AHI videos, but it's something that is really important. And we did find again in our study that there are lots of roadways. I think 50% of farms had at least one cow track that was classified as rough or very rough. So there's lots of scope for improvement. So that's probably one area that, if people were to look at and try and go out and invest a little bit in it, would the roadways is probably going to give you the biggest payoff in terms of reducing lameness.
I think the vast majority of farmers and cash flow as we head into the second half of 2025 should be pretty good. And the vast majority of farmers would benefit from, let it be topping up roadways or maybe completely resurface and
Yeah, yeah,
them. So it's something for our listeners to think about
definitely. Yeah.
in terms of expenditure in the back of the year. But one other element, and I'm seeing it, maybe it's gaining in popularity, and especially in high traffic areas, as maybe cows are entering the yard or closer to the yard, is astroturf and the laying of astroturf on roadways. Your opinion on that, or is there any work done on that? What's your views
Yeah,
around?
so I'm no, I can't say there isn't any work done. I'm actually not familiar with any studies that have specifically looked at astroturf, but there could be out there. I
Mm.
can't say for sure there isn't. Um, it's definitely a good surface for cows to walk on. It's soft, it's forgiving, and if there's no stones on top of it, it's ideal really. So we didn't have any farms in our study that used AstroTurf, but I have heard anecdotally from people that have put it in place that it's working really well and people are very happy with it. So definitely worth considering, as you said, especially in high traffic areas as well. If you're not going to be doing the entire farm roadway system, the high traffic areas are the ones to concentrate on.
Yeah, and I think the importance from people that have done that, Muireann, is that it has to go down on a very good surface. So it's repair the surface and then put the
Yes,
astroturf
yes,
down
exactly.
rather
You
than
can't you can't
trying
be
to fix an
slapping the
issue.
AstroTurf on top of a surface that's uneven or full of holes or stones and things like that. That's an important point too. Yes.
If you were to highlight one or two changes from what you've seen throughout your studies that'd make the biggest difference on a typical Irish dairy farm from a lameness point of view, what would they be?
Yeah, well, I suppose well, we mentioned roadways. Roadways are key, and I think everyone could probably benefit from improving their roadways. I guess going back to the mobility scoring, I think trying to identify cows early and treat them early would also make a big difference too to cows that are lame.
So that
Um,
early intervention.
Yet that early intervention is really important. Um, I guess our study didn't specifically examine cow handling practices on farm as well, but that's something that people can think about. And it's actually when we talk about, the cost of improving roadways and infrastructure is can be quite high, but the way we handle our cows is completely cost neutral. We don't have to spend any money to move them more slowly and move them more gently, and that can have a huge impact as well. So, so even something as simple as putting in a bat latch that, this automatic gate opener that just allows cows to kind of wander into the parlor in their own time for milking, that can potentially have significant impacts on lameness as well. And I suppose, yeah, like having a lameness plan is probably very important as well. Not many of our farmers in our study had a lameness plan. And I think that's probably an area where people can improve a lot, that we have a plan for how we're going to prevent lameness, how we're going to monitor it, how we'll record it and treat it. It's always good to have a plan for how you're going to deal with something and prevent it. Then it can be reviewed and you can monitor how you're doing with it. But um,
Having
no,
those, as you say, that's an interesting point, and having the plan or the protocols as to, you know, how it's going to be addressed at farm level.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that
Means the
ideally
job
should
gets
be
done.
something you would make with your vet, your Teagasc advisor, your hoof trimmer, that everybody who's involved in dealing with lameness on your farm has a kind of an input in there, and everyone is working together to address the lameness issue.
One particular thing, and interestingly, I was at there's a number of Teagasc infrastructure events that have been held and are being held around the country, and even that whole conversation around cow flow and how cows enter and exit the yard, and that's an area where farmers could actually have a look at sometimes maybe changing the roadway structure, how the enter or exit will help from a cow flow point of view. The last point, Muireann, I want to touch on is you have a new pilot project, which is aiming to try a lameness control program on dairy farms. Just in the interest of time, could you give us a brief description of what's going to be involved in that?
Yeah, so this is an exciting new pilot project which is being run by um, the Animal Health Ireland Hoof Health Check Technical Working Group. So we have a number of partners in there: Teagasc, AHI, ICBF. Sorry, I'm not going to mention everybody, but it's there's lots of people involved there. And the aim is to trial. I was talking just briefly a second ago about the importance of having a plan. This is about having a lameness management plan, structured plan on farms. It's going to run for 3 years. We're going to have 10 farmers enrolled. And I suppose what's going to be involved from the farmer point of view, the farmer is going to mobility score the herd every month or as regularly as we can work out is practical and feasible to do. We're going to be uploading that data to ICBF. Then there's going to be hoof trimmers coming following that to regularly trim these cows. And then another key part of it is having a risk assessment, a lameness risk assessment conducted about 6 times throughout the course of the program. And this is, again, a key part of addressing lameness. It's going out to look at the farm, the situation, the bigger picture, the environment, the handling, the feeding. There's so many factors that impact why lameness occurs. So doing this risk assessment, identifying maybe 3 actions a farmer can take to improve the lameness situation, and then the farmer will try and address those 3 actions over the course of the next months, and then there'll be a review lameness risk assessment conducted. And in this way, we hope to see, does having a structured lameness control plan in place, is it effective in reducing lameness? And we would be very hopeful that yes, it would be. So that's just starting. We haven't finalized our farmers yet, but hopefully we'll have some interesting results to show over the coming years.
Our listeners look forward to seeing the outcomes of that. So that's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast. My thanks to Muireann Conneely for joining me on this week's show. If you have any questions about this week's episode or have suggested topics you would like discussed, you can send them to us at the following email address: dairyedge.podcast@teagasc.ie. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm James Dunne, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.